Let's get into some climate change news. More news about the high heat in the northern climes, particularly on the west coast. Alaska sees 80-degree heat, while the east is blasted with record cold and snow. Here's why. Well, we already know why. But they're explaining this to people that might not be paying attention to, anything in the world. Why is that? This is really strange. Somebody who just was born today, one of those 100,000 people that were just born today. Why is that? Over Mother's Day weekend, parts of New England received over 6 inches of snow. The cities across eastern U.S. woke up to record low temperatures. All the while, Alaska had sunshine and near record-breaking high temperatures over the weekend, including an 82-degree temperature reading in Fairbanks on Sunday. That is crazy. Crazy hot for Alaska, crazy hot for May. As you know, of course, the polar vortex and the coldest air spilled into the eastern U.S. It made space for a warm-up to move up the west coast into western Canada and Alaska. While not as pronounced, the same pattern is continuing the first half of this week. Forecast highs in Fairbanks and Juneau are higher than most locations across the lower 48. Showing 73 in Seattle, 72 in Reno, 72 in LA. While other places in the country are chilly. The warm temperatures over the past week have also led to rapid snow melt, with local forecasters warning of flood advisories in the Alaska interior. So all those people that are like, whoa, we had record snow this year, or not record, but higher than usual snow. And that's true. We had higher than usual snow on the West Coast, but now we're getting higher than usual temperatures. And that means all that higher than usual snow is going to melt away. So that is that. Let me move on to this. So we were talking about high Arctic heat. Maybe it was last week, we were talking about Arctic ice melting very rapidly to possibly 10 million square kilometers or less by the middle of the month. We are now at May 12th. So there's forecasts, 3-day, 5-day, and 10-day forecasts for the Arctic Ocean, all showing the entire ocean above freezing. Not good. Not good at all. So this is in line with what was forecast last week around the possible rapid ice melt in the Arctic. Today's Arctic max temperature shows a good half of the Arctic basin reaching above freezing, suggesting the forecast may be correct. So extremely high temperature here. If y'all see that. Temperature anomaly. And then this big patch of cold air, this is where all the Arctic air is down here. Somebody says not unusual though. Okay. So yeah, interesting thread. Everybody's pretty much like, oh, this isn't This isn't great. Anyways, just wanted to show you that. We'll keep an eye on that and see where that leads us. In the next week or two, if we're going to get some serious ice melt before June. Let's see. This is from Truth Out. Fossil fuels already getting billions in bailouts. They're called subsidies. So, recently, the Federal Reserve announced that it would be loosening its lending guidelines so that more corporations, even those with massive pre-existing debts, could take part in the bailout feeding frenzy. All right. Because, the people are still wondering where their money is, or when they're going to get their help, or what's going to happen in the next 6 months. But, don't worry, all the corporations are going to be fine. As Alexis Goldstein explains, the main beneficiary of these changes was the group that lobbied hardest for them, the fossil fuel industry. Of all the reasons why coal, oil, and gas companies don't deserve more public support, there's one that's particularly glaring. They're already getting it. That's right. Every year for over a century, these companies have gotten tens of billions of dollars in bailouts. They're just called something different: subsidies. The level of existing government support for the fossil fuel industry is so widespread that it's difficult to calculate. Oil Change International, which has tracked fossil fuel subsidies for years, estimates that direct U.S. government subsidies to oil, gas, and coal companies total around $20 billion a year. These figures don't account for the high costs that fossil fuels impose on our environment and public health, nor the $81 billion that the military spends each year on defending oil reserves overseas, costs that all end up being borne by the public. When you factor these costs, to get a sense of the total subsidies the industry is receiving each year, the numbers skyrocket. According to the 2019 working paper by the International Monetary Fund, the true cost of U.S. fossil fuel subsidies is something closer to $649 billion a year. That's closer to $1 trillion than not. That's nearly 10 times the Department of Education's budget, $68 billion. It's also roughly 15 times the $42 billion that went to the National Institutes of Health in 2020. These subsidies have gone on in various forms for over a century. Over that time, have oil and gas companies used this extravagant government support to create a stable energy industry that sustains workers and communities so they're well equipped to weather crises like the current COVID-19 pandemic? No, of course not. Just the opposite. Over the last decade, oil and gas companies have been on a reckless spending spree, taking on huge amounts of debt to drill ever more wells and pump ever more carbon into the atmosphere. The resulting glut of oil has led to mass layoffs across the country. Between 2014 and 2016, long before COVID-19 and the current price war, oil and gas companies laid off 195,000 workers because of cheap oil prices, and many of these jobs never returned when prices increased. Oil and gas companies also failed to deliver for investors, including the millions of Americans who own stocks in the sector, because their pension funds have yet to divest from fossil fuels as a category. Oil and gas stocks placed dead last in the S&P 500's index from 2010 to 2019. I did not know that. That's crazy. Anyways, we all know how dead in the water the fossil fuel industry is at the moment and should remain. But of course, are we going to see an end to these subsidies? I seriously doubt it. Got one more thing to look at before I end this video. Record global carbon dioxide concentrations despite COVID-19 crisis. Over the past few weeks, there have been many reports of localized air quality improvements as the world is locked down to combat the coronavirus pandemic. However, no one should think that the climate crisis is therefore over. Far from it. The most recent data from the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association shows global carbon dioxide levels rising sharply. In April 2020, the average concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was 416 parts per million, the highest since measurements began in Hawaii in 1958. It's actually higher than that now. It's been at least up to 418. Furthermore, ice core records indicate that such levels have not been seen in the last 800,000 years. The United Nations Environment Programme's World Environment Situation Room shows a sharp increase in CO2 concentrations of more than 100 parts per million since March 1958. The curve shows expected seasonal fluctuations. The northern hemisphere has a greater landmass than the southern hemisphere and more vegetation absorbing CO2 during the summer. Global CO2 concentrations peak in May at the end of the northern hemisphere winter. Then, as photosynthesis takes place and new foliage appears, it absorbs CO2, lowering concentrations by about 7.5 parts per million until October. During the northern hemisphere winter, the Earth has less photosynthesis activity, so CO2 concentrations go up until the next cycle. However, owing to anthropogenic CO2 emissions, those are emissions from human activities, CO2 concentrations are not only increasing but accelerating. The following graph shows the difference in CO2 concentrations between 1 month and the same month 1 year before, e.g. plus 2.88 parts per million between April 2020 and April 2019. It shows that while the increase over 1 year was around 0.9 parts per million, during the 1960s, it rose to 2.4 parts per million on average. During the 2010 to 2019 period, there is clearly accelerating upward trend. The long-term view, using ice core records, it is possible to measure CO2 trapped in deep Antarctic ice going back 800,000 years. We have never in the last 800,000 years reached 416 parts per million. But, the climate is always changing, and this is fine. Don't worry about it. Some people might want to tell you, given that Homo sapiens appeared about 300,000 years ago, and the first trace of Homo sapiens sapiens, also called anatomically modern humans, dates to 196,000 years ago, no individual of our species has experienced such high levels of CO2. This is important to remember. This is, of course, of great concern for our climate and demonstrates yet again that urgent action is needed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. To keep average global warming to 1.5 C, we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2040. How about earlier? Or 2055 at the latest. How about a lot earlier? Green Party says 2030. And I happen to agree with that. A lot of people would happen to agree with that. Extinction Rebellion says 2025. It says Pascal Peduzzi, director of UNEP Grid Geneva and program manager of the World Environmental Situation Room. Where is this situation room? Where is it? Can we get in there? Can we get in the situation room? Can we get an invitation? And as you can see, over the last 800,000 years, here it is, here it is, here it is. This is the weather. This is the climate always changing. This is the climate always changing. So, yes, the climate always changes like this. The climate does not change like this. This is not the climate always changing here. Over here. Hello. Just look at a graph. That's all you got to do. These results may come as a surprise to those who optimistically assume that COVID-19 will reduce total global emissions. While it is true that vehicular and air traffic as well as industrial activity has reduced sharply in most parts of the world since January 2020. This is not the case with our electricity supply. 64% of the global electricity energy mix comes from fossil fuels. Remember that coal has doubled in the last 10 years, according to the World Energy Outlook 2019. Heating systems have been functioning as before COVID-19. None of the fundamentals have changed, such as the shift to renewable energy, public transport, deforestation, etc. Forest fires and wildfires that are increasing in likelihood and severity due to climate change continue to affect swaths of Brazil, Honduras, Myanmar, Thailand, and Venezuela, each fire emitting large amounts of additional CO2. Without fundamental shifts in global energy production, we should have no reason to expect a lasting reduction in emissions, says UNEP climate change expert Nicholas Hagelberg. COVID-19 instead provides us with a chance to take stock of the risks we are taking in our unsustainable relationship with our environment and seize the opportunity to rebuild our economies in more environmentally responsible ways. We must take serious account of global threats such as pandemics and climate disaster in order to build resilient markets, companies, countries, global systems, and healthy, sustainable future for everyone. How about degrowth, degrowth, degrowth? Compassionate degrowth. How about degrowing our economies instead of talking about environmentally responsible ways? Yeah, environmentally responsible means taking growth out of the equation, out of the human system equation. Supporting fiscal stimulus and finance packages, that's growth. To take advantage of decarbonization and the accelerating renewable and clean energy transition, it's also growth. We're not talking about degrowth here, which we should be. Will not be just a short-term economic win. Blah blah blah. Anyways, kind of hated the end of that article. Kind of hated it, but anyways, some good information in there for you. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Hey guys, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can also support the channel at the links below: PayPal, Square, Patreon. Thank you so much.